start with Giancana, of course, but I want all the bosses checked out.
Well, I'm sure Hoffa was happy, but I suggest that you find out if he was proud. Find out if he was taking credit.
I want the locks changed on all the files. I want anything sensitive, anything at all, removed to the old executive office and kept under 24-hour guard.
Don't give me that. We both know the FBI received threats from your Cuban exile group less than 3 weeks ago.
I swear to God, John, if the CIA had anything to do with this, I'm going to end some careers around here. No, I want the truth.
Well, we don't have much, but it appears that Oswald had some contact with the CIA a few years back.
You're telling me that the president's killer worked for you?
Very briefly. It was all tied up in that Cuban mess.
Was he working alone?
We don't know.
Well, find out.
We're into it.
Where was our intelligence on this?
The day the secrets became public never left them. Not one of them. There had always been whispers, always rumors. Back in New Orleans in the 1890s, men talked in half sentences about rituals, about blood and vows, about something older than the police, and quieter than the courts. Journalists wrote around it. Politicians pretended it wasn't there. Everyone knew, but no one knew. Until September 27th, 1963. That was the day Joseph Valachi sat under the lights and spoke plainly. No euphemisms, no folklore, no romance. He named it. He explained it. He turned the mafia from a rumor into a broadcast. America watched. Millions of people sat frozen in front of their televisions, watching a man calmly describe a society that had lived in the dark for generations. The initiation, the prick of the finger, the blood, the burning saint. The oath that ended with a sentence no one could ever take back. You betray the family, you die. They learned the names that had lived only in police files and whispered conversations. Anastasia, Luciano, Joe Adonis, Maranzano, Bonanno, men who had shaped cities without ever appearing on a ballot. Men whose decisions had rippled through unions, docks, courts, and police departments for decades. And then the senator asked about Louisiana. The camera caught it, the slightest pause, the shift in Valachi's eyes. Then he answered. Carlos Marcello. Not a nickname, not a legend, a man. Valachi said it simply. You don't enter Louisiana without his permission. You don't move in the Gulf without his blessing. You go through your captain. Your captain goes through your boss. And eventually someone asks Marcello. If he says no, that's the end of it. Who doesn't like it? The senator asked. Valachi didn't hesitate. Carlos Marcello. Somewhere far from the cameras, a cigar went out. Marcello understood immediately what this meant. This wasn't rumor anymore. This wasn't law enforcement pretending ignorance. This was exposure. This was ritual, stripped of mystery, and broadcast into living rooms. Once that happens, secrecy doesn't recover. It only retaliates or dies. Marcello had respected New York. He respected Costello, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno. He respected order. But what he saw now was chaos, murders stacked on top of betrayals, bosses falling, families tearing themselves apart, Luciano exiled, others imprisoned, New York devouring itself in public view. Too much noise, too much heat. There was only one power structure left that still understood discipline. The old money. The Gulf. The men who had worked quietly with oil, shipping, intelligence. Men who didn't need to brag because their influence was structural. Marcello had been part of that world long before Valachi ever spoke. Long before the CIA even had a name. His family's ties ran through Sam Zamurray and the United Fruit Empire, through ports and plantations, through favors traded before anyone thought to write them down. Zemre had attended the funerals of Marcello's people. Marcello had returned the respect when Zemre died, something that did not go unnoticed, because respect like that crossed lines most men wouldn't dare cross. These were not street gangsters. These were architects. They had helped shape intelligence networks, placed men where they needed to be placed, supported operations in Florida, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic. JM/WAVE. Exile, camps, Corsican gunmen. Things that never appeared on television and never would. And now the Kennedys were shining a light. Marcello didn't need a speech to understand the consequence. Once secret societies were named publicly, once rituals were explained on camera, once senators spoke openly about chains of command, the unwritten agreement was broken. Power could survive attacks. It could not survive exposure. Guy Bannister sat nearby that day. So did David Ferry. Men who understood pressure, who understood leverage. They watched Valachi. They watched Marcello. They watched the clock begin to move. Marcello's court date loomed November 22nd, 1963. The same day, the president would ride through Dallas. Bannister leaned in, half curious, half smiling, and asked if it was true. The rituals, the godfathers, the initiation. He tried to make it sound academic, even playful. Marcello did not smile. There were only a handful of men who could joke with him. Bannister was not one of them. Marcello turned slowly. The mask, the dumb, harmless act, fell away. What looked back at Bannister was not a politician or a criminal. It was something colder, older, focused. He spoke quietly, close. You ask about rituals. What about yours? He spoke of blindfolds, of humiliation, of oaths, of men paraded and measured and owned by their own fraternities. He spoke of Masons, of politicians, of Hoover and his clubs and his secrets. He spoke of different uniforms worn by the same kind of men. Masons, mafiosi, politicians, intelligence officers, different names, same structure. Bannister went silent. He understood then that Valachi hadn't just testified. He had detonated something, and once detonated, there was no putting it back. September 27th, 1963 wasn't just a hearing. It was the moment secrecy died in public. And once that happened, something else had to follow. But for Carlos Marcello, the moment never truly passed. Power had a memory. So did exile. He had lived it himself. In 1961, the government reminded him how quickly a man could be reduced, detained, deported, stripped of position and certainty in a matter of hours. A lever pulled quietly, efficiently. Marcello understood then what he had always suspected. The state never forgot where it kept its tools. He had seen it before, long before Valachi, long before television lights. In December 1946, Havana hosted a gathering that mattered, the kind of meeting that never made headlines, but rearranged the balance of the underworld all the same. Marcello was there. For the first time, he shook hands with Lucky Luciano, not as an errand boy or intermediary, but as the undisputed boss of New Orleans. By then, Marcello was already managing his family's reach across the Gulf states, tied directly into Luciano's Genovese apparatus through Frank Costello. He saw how deeply Luciano had embedded himself in New Orleans, how methodically the connections had been laid: ports, labor, shipping, money. Then, in 1947, he watched Luciano deported from Havana back to Italy. He watched an empire sag, not collapse, not yet, but bend. Luciano returned to a world being quietly repurposed. The war was over, Mussolini was gone, and American elites were sketching something new, an intelligence service built on secrecy, deniability, and distance. Italy mattered, Sicily mattered, and Luciano, exiled but intact, was the perfect instrument. From Naples to Palermo, He moved through shattered hierarchies, restoring men imprisoned or sidelined under fascism, elevating those who understood loyalty, discipline, and silence. With Luciano back in circulation, the Mafia was reorganized and stitched to its American counterpart once more. Official names followed: Operation Underworld, Operation Gladio, but the mechanics never changed. Organized crime filled the spaces governments couldn't touch openly. In France, the Corsicans stabilized docks, broke communist unions, and kept the ports moving. Marseille became a pipeline, heroin flowing cleanly into the ports of the Gulf. By the time the Central Intelligence Agency formally existed, it was already running operations beyond its mandate and its budget. The solution was as old as power itself: narcotics money, laundering networks, and expansion disguised as chaos. Marcello was not watching from the sidelines. He was financing it. His interests radiated outward: London, Havana, the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia. Money moved quietly. Favors followed, influence hardened. But Marcello saw something others didn't. He saw what the Mafia was becoming: bloated, impatient, addicted to its own legend. Exposure was no longer an accident. It was inevitable. New Orleans was different. It always had been. Where other families recruited from streets and neighborhoods, New Orleans was blood. To belong, you shared it, by birth or marriage. That was the cost. That was the filter. Marcello himself had married into a powerful mafiosi family tied to the Silver Dollar Sam faction, the group that consolidated power after the fall of Charles Matranga. Authority narrowed, tightened, until it rested entirely in his hands. No theatrics, no noise. For 40 years, as presidents rose and fell, Marcello endured. He outlasted the Kennedys. He outlasted Nixon. He navigated dictators, intelligence services, and secret fraternities without ever stepping fully into the light. Those societies had always existed, threaded through American history, reinforcing elite control behind curtains no one was meant to see. The Kennedys wanted the curtain torn down. They wanted exposure, proof, confirmation that these networks existed, that they shaped government long before anyone called it a deep state. That was the threat. Not ideology, not crime, visibility. And Carlos Marcello never forgot what happened when power decided a man had become inconvenient. Power never rises in a vacuum. It rises when systems fail, when people are hungry, frightened, and desperate for order. The Great Depression didn't just collapse banks and factories, it broke faith, faith in markets, faith in democracy, faith in restraint. Across the world, men who promised certainty began to look like saviors. In Italy, that man was Benito Mussolini. He didn't seize power in a single stroke. He fed on humiliation. Italy had won the First World War and gained almost nothing from it. Veterans returned to unemployment. Inflation erased savings. Strikes paralyzed cities. Liberal governments debated while the country bled. Mussolini understood the moment. He wrapped violence in nationalism and sold chaos as discipline. Black shirts beat socialists in the streets while industrialists quietly financed him. Landowners feared revolution more than dictatorship. The Vatican feared atheistic communism more than fascism. When Mussolini marched on Rome, the king stepped aside. Order, any order, was preferable to collapse. The Depression turned that preference into a global contagion. Democracies looked weak. Dictators looked efficient. Mussolini cast himself as a modern Caesar. Trains on time, unions crushed, dissent silenced. Behind the pageantry was a thriving black market economy. Sanctions created scarcity. Scarcity created opportunity. War preparation created demand. Criminal networks flourished in the margins of the state, feeding off the same pressures that fed the regime. When Franklin D. Roosevelt finally began tightening the vice on organized crime in the United States, one of the first major figures to move was Vito Genovese. He didn't hide. He went home, to Italy. Fascist Italy welcomed him. Mussolini didn't care about Genovese's record as long as he was useful. Genovese arrived with money, logistics, and American connections. He slid into the black market effortlessly. Currency manipulation, smuggling, narcotics. He cultivated Mussolini's inner circle, including the Duce's son-in-law, a man crippled by addiction and appetite. That weakness became leverage, drugs, cash, favors. Under fascism, Genovese didn't just survive, he prospered. Italy wasn't unique, Germany was worse. The Weimar Republic collapsed under the same forces: hyperinflation, humiliation, mass unemployment. The Nazis didn't invent hatred. They organized it. They promised work, pride, and revenge. And their appeal reached far beyond Germany's borders. Fascism wasn't alien to America in the 1930s. It had admirers, and not fringe ones. Industrialists saw Hitler as a barrier against labor movements and socialism. Banks saw opportunity. Corporations saw contracts. Henry Ford was openly revered in Germany. His writings circulated among Nazi leadership. American capital flowed through subsidiaries and financial channels that kept German industry alive long after moral clarity should have intervened. This wasn't extremism. It was respectable. Suits and boardrooms, not torches and rallies. By the time Roosevelt took office and Hitler consolidated power, the alignments were already forming. Joseph P. Kennedy, America's ambassador to Britain, viewed Nazi Germany with disturbing sympathy. He believed democracy was failing. He believed authoritarian systems worked. He believed accommodation was smarter than resistance. These were not private musings. They reflected a worldview that saw power as something to be managed, not challenged. What Luciano and his circle never fully grasped was that they were late to a game others had been playing for centuries. Aristocrats, bankers, dynasties. They didn't fear criminals. They used them. Fascism didn't rise to serve gangsters. Gangsters attached themselves to fascism because it offered hierarchy, order, and protection for profit. But fascism had limits. It tolerated parallel power only while it was useful. Once authority consolidated, rivals became liabilities. That was when Hitler turned on the Freemasons. Lodges were raided, membership rolls seized, assets confiscated. Networks that had once operated quietly within society were suddenly branded subversive. The message was clear: no divided loyalties. The crackdown wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger purge of ambiguity, independence, and anything outside direct control. And it sent a shock through every underground network watching closely, from Sicily to New York. Because once the state decides it no longer needs intermediaries, it doesn't negotiate with them. It erases them. Hitler didn't wage war with tanks and rifles alone. He waged it with paper. Files mattered as much as weapons. He didn't just want enemies broken in the streets, he wanted them dismantled on the page. Names, networks, membership rolls, letters, ritual notes, meeting minutes. The wiring diagram of how influence actually moved. In the Nazi imagination, Freemasonry wasn't a social fraternity. It was a rival system of power, international, discreet, threaded through liberal democracy, and linked in propaganda to Jews, bankers, parliamentarians, and the entire old order the Reich intended to erase. The story sold to the public was simple and effective. Freemasons were a hidden force blocking the new Europe, hoarding political and esoteric secrets that explained Germany's humiliation and justified their removal. When Hitler took power in 1933, the crackdown came early. Lodges were dissolved. Property was seized. Freemasonry was designated an enemy category, not because the Nazis had proven some grand conspiracy, but because totalitarian systems cannot tolerate parallel loyalties. Any network outside direct control, especially one that crossed borders, professions, and political lines, had to be broken. As the war expanded, the hunt became systematic. On June 14, 1940, German troops entered Paris. The city was declared open. France collapsed and the occupation moved with familiar efficiency. Neutralize institutions, seize records, take possession of the state's memory. Ministries, police files, foreign affairs archives, trade unions, political registries, and the lodges. In the Nazi worldview, power in France didn't reside only in government buildings. It resided in Freemasonry as well. The lodges, rightly or wrongly, were associated with the Third Republic, with Republican governance, with the old political class. That belief made them immediate targets. Raids began in Paris and spread outward. The major obediences were hit first. Archives were boxed, stacked, and removed with care, as if a bank vault were being emptied. Two forces worked in parallel. One was bureaucratic, the security apparatus doing what it always did: seize, catalogue, control. The other was ideological. Alfred Rosenberg, chief propagandist and obsessive conspiracist, wasn't satisfied with destruction alone. He wanted proof. Documents that could be shaped into explanations for why democracies resisted Nazism. He treated stolen archives as ideological raw material, dressing delusion in the language of scholarship. But the real value of the lodges wasn't mystical. It was practical. Those archives weren't just rituals and symbols. They were maps. Who knew whom? Who held office? Who corresponded? Who influenced policy? Who could be purged? Who could be blackmailed? Who could be pressured into silence? In occupied France, paperwork became a weapon. Files were created, records updated, careers ended quietly, civil servants were removed, some were prosecuted, some deported. A life didn't always end with a firing squad. Sometimes it ended with a form and a stamp. Violence backed by administration. That was the modern method. The Reich kept collecting. In Germany, seized lodge buildings were repurposed. Materials were sorted and indexed. Translators and specialists struggled through volumes spanning centuries, from 18th century minutes to modern political correspondence. There was too much to read in full. But reading everything was never the goal. Ownership was. As the war turned and bombing intensified, the archives were moved again, evacuated to remote locations like strategic assets, castles, depots, fortified storage. Some collections ended up under SS control, others were scattered. By the war's end, the archives themselves became prizes. The Allies wanted them for intelligence. The Soviets wanted them for intelligence and leverage. Everyone understood the same thing. Archives are not just history. They are operational value. Some material was returned. Much of it wasn't. For decades, large sections of Europe's institutional memory sat behind sealed doors, studied, summarized, and classified. The men who seized those records understood a fundamental truth. If you control a society's files, you don't just steal its past, you gain leverage over its future. Bring that understanding across the Atlantic, and paranoia hardens into policy. Freemasonry in the United States had long been part of public life. It was common, respectable, embedded. Business leaders, lawyers, politicians, presidents. J. Edgar Hoover himself was a Mason. That visibility made it easy for extremists to transform familiarity into mythology. And Hitler believed the myth. He saw Freemasonry as an international system capable of shaping governments, influencing elections, even making presidents, particularly in the United States. Whether that belief was true never mattered. What mattered was how the Nazis acted on it. They treated lodges like enemy command centers. They targeted them early. They stripped them. They seized their records the way an army seizes codebooks. In Hitler's thinking, the most valuable secret wasn't scientific. It was the blueprint of influence. The deeper irony was this. The Nazi regime didn't eliminate secret society thinking. It absorbed it. It replaced independent networks with state-owned ones, private ritual with public ceremony, inherited tradition with manufactured myth. One leader, one party, one destiny. That was what the raids were really about, not hatred alone, but consolidation, a war to control the hidden structure beneath politics. And once the Reich had defined the enemy lodges, the next step was unavoidable. Its own mystical programs, its own symbolic obsessions, its own internal cult of destiny. When the state decided it didn't just want to rule history, it wanted to rewrite it. By the time the world went to war, Mussolini had already fought a private war of his own in Sicily, one the regime boasted about, filmed, photographed, and sold as proof that fascism could succeed where liberal Italy had failed. The claim was simple. The Duce had broken the Mafia. For centuries, the Mafia had functioned as a state within the state. It didn't require elections. It didn't rely on paperwork. It didn't ask permission. It lived in the gaps, between landlord and tenant, police and prisoner, village and export market. It controlled votes. It brokered favors. It settled disputes. It could destroy a man with a whisper, or save him with a nod. In Sicily, the Mafia didn't merely survive government. It partnered with it, infiltrated it, and outlasted it. Mussolini understood what that meant. While climbing to power, he tolerated local strongmen. But once he crowned himself Duce, once he sold the image of total authority, he could not allow any competing power to exist. Sicily challenged the myth. The Mafia wasn't just crime. It was competition, a rival oath, a rival chain of command, a rival system of fear. In 1924, Mussolini went to Sicily and met that reality head-on. In one village, the local boss, Francesco Cuccia, made a point of addressing him publicly. He told Mussolini he didn't need all those carabinieri and bodyguards. On this ground, Cuccia said, the Duce was under his protection. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a reminder, delivered in public, that Mussolini's power had borders. Mussolini didn't forgive humiliation. He processed it the way dictators process everything. As a problem to be eliminated completely. Within weeks, he appointed Cesare Mori, the Iron Prefect, and gave him extraordinary authority to do what the Italian state had never done with consistency. Wage war on the Mafia as if it were an insurgency. Mori didn't operate within limits. He out-Mafia the Mafia. He laid siege to strongholds like Gangi. He took hostages. He burned crops. He slaughtered livestock. Torture was routine. Arrests came by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Cages, courts, photographs, headlines. This wasn't enforcement alone. It was theatre. Mussolini wanted the image broadcast clearly. The state crushing the old Sicilian order, fascism, as the only power willing to be ruthless enough to rule. The campaign worked in the way terror campaigns always work. It didn't eliminate the Mafia as a culture, but it shattered its sense of safety. It disrupted chains of command. It made Sicily dangerous for men who had once moved as if untouchable. And it forced an exodus. Mafiosi fled. Many went where the future was, America, New York. They didn't arrive as peasants. They arrived as professionals. They brought experience, discipline, contacts, and a memory of what happens when the state decides to crush you outright. That's the part often missed. Mussolini didn't just attack the Mafia. He educated it. He taught it a lesson that would shape its future. If you stay concentrated, the state can find you and destroy you. If you spread out, if you build a system that crosses borders and oceans, you can survive any single government. You can wait out any regime. So, the Mafia adapted. It evolved. And while Mussolini performed strength from Rome, the men driven out of Sicily helped build something new abroad. Modern, corporate, disciplined. By the time Europe was burning, Sicily was no longer just an island. It was a node in a much larger machine. War brought the next collision. By 1943, the Allies were ready to crack Fortress Europe, and Sicily was the door. The invasion hit the island with overwhelming force. Mussolini's regime, already weakened by military failure, shortages, and collapsing legitimacy, absorbed the blow directly. Within weeks, Mussolini fell. The myth shattered. The man who promised absolute control became just another body removed from the board. In Sicily, the old order resurfaced. Mussolini's purge had produced a generation of men who knew exactly who had tried to erase them. They didn't need ideology. They didn't need speeches. They needed opportunity. War creates black markets. Occupation creates vacancies. Confusion creates new bosses. As fascist administrators collapsed, local authority had to be filled. Men with ready-made networks, men who could impose rules instantly, stepped forward. The Mafia didn't return as outlaws. It returned as respectability. Mayors, intermediaries, trusted faces. Power was reclaimed quietly, not through spectacle, but through restoration. Through control of food and grain, control of land disputes, control of patronage. Control of the roads between towns and the small decisions that determined who ate and who didn't. They worked politics the way they always had, placing allies, rewarding loyalty, punishing resistance, turning public office into private protection. Mussolini had tried to destroy them with force. History destroyed him with momentum. Dictators can imprison men. They can torture them. They can empty villages and fill cells. What they cannot do is kill a system that has learned how to migrate. They cannot erase a network that knows how to disappear, reform, and attach itself to the next authority that walks in the door. That was the lesson Sicily carried into the post-war world. The Mafia did not defeat Mussolini in a direct fight. It outlasted him. It waited. It adapted. And the moment the regime faltered, it stepped back into the light, stronger, smarter, and certain that no uniform, no balcony speech, no declaration of absolute power could ever fully control what Sicily had been producing for centuries. A shadow government that survives every government. Vito Genovese didn't arrive in Europe like a fugitive. He arrived like a man auditioning for a regime. He dressed it up as business. He carried himself like a political sympathizer, a useful American with money and contacts, someone who understood power and didn't flinch at violence. He sold the image Mussolini wanted to buy: order, discipline, certainty. In those years, that image was currency. Genovese knew how to spend it. He also carried the uglier instincts of his world: prejudice, suspicion, and a hard, tribal contempt that shaped how he judged allies and enemies. In the American underworld, which wasn't an opinion, it was a fault line. The moment the rackets became multinational, the old ethnic boundaries started breaking down, because the money didn't care. Costello understood that. Luciano understood it. Genovese resented it. And that resentment followed him like a shadow, because it wasn't just about who sat at the table. It was about who controlled the future. In Italy, Genovese found what he needed: a state that didn't ask polite questions, and a black market that never slept. Mussolini's war on the Mafia had scattered men, collapsed local chains of command, and created vacancies the way every purge does. Some bosses went underground, some went abroad, Some offered their services to the very machine trying to crush them, trading information and loyalty for protection. Genovese, an American mafioso with the instincts of a political operator, slipped into that opening. Whether he was acting as a helper, a broker, a profiteer, or something more ambiguous depends on who's telling the story. But the outcome is harder to dispute. He prospered. War economies always produce two things at once: rationing and opportunity. As Europe fractured, narcotics and stimulants moved through the same channels as food, fuel, and stolen supplies. Morphine, heroin, cocaine derivatives, amphetamines, some legal, some diverted, some manufactured at scale under the cover of medicine, relief, or military necessity. The New World didn't run on speeches alone. It ran on chemicals, and men who could move chemicals, quietly, efficiently, became indispensable to both criminals and states. Genovese understood the real trick. You don't move product like a street dealer. You move it like cargo. You hide it inside legitimate industries. Fruit, olive oil, canned goods, shipping crates, warehouses, freight schedules. The same machinery that fed cities could carry poison into them. And the same port connections that built mafia power in America, New York, New Orleans, the Gulf, could be repurposed to receive it. That's where story locks into the Marcello world, because this isn't just Vito's hustle. It's the early blueprint of how the underworld and the official world kept brushing up against each other, sometimes colliding, sometimes cooperating, sometimes pretending they'd never met. And then the war ended. Officially, the new era was clean. Democracy restored. Reconstruction. Institutions rebuilt. The speeches changed. But the pipelines didn't disappear. They just got reassigned. The Office of Strategic Services had already learned what Mussolini had taught the Mafia the hard way. You can't operate globally without intermediaries. You need fixers, couriers, dockmen, translators, people who can move goods in the dark and make problems vanish without paperwork. After 1947, the CIA inherited that mindset. Secrecy as a method, deniability as a shield. And once secrecy becomes policy, you don't always get to choose what it touches. Money needs channels. Operations need cover. Cover attracts criminals the way light attracts moths. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it's where the story stops being a morality tale and becomes a systems story. Law enforcement didn't describe it as romance. They described it as logistics. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, federal agents were talking about an Atlantic pipeline, refining centers in Europe, longshore access, freight concealment, distribution crews in American cities. Writers and investigators argued over who sat at the top, who took orders from whom, who was exaggerating, who was protecting themselves. Some accounts turned it into a single world syndicate. Others reduced it to a series of overlapping crews. The truth, like it always is in this world, was messier and more dangerous. Multiple networks moving in parallel, occasionally aligned, occasionally at war, with the same names reappearing because the same men controlled the same choke points. In America, Harry Anslinger made narcotics his battlefield. He blamed it on the underworld, on Luciano, on the Mafia, on foreign suppliers, and sometimes his targets were real, sometimes political, sometimes both. But even inside the underworld, there was a quieter argument. Who was actually running what? Luciano, watching from exile, insisted he wasn't the kingpin the papers wanted him to be. He admitted to introductions, to knowing the men, to the inevitable proximity that comes with being who he was. But he also pointed towards something darker, that there were people in the United States who benefited from the flow continuing. Because addiction wasn't just profit, it was leverage. Drugs didn't just generate money. They softened neighborhoods, destabilized communities, and created a permanent class of desperate people who could be managed, used, and discarded. Systems don't collapse, they evolve. Then the 1950s turn into a pressure cooker. Appalachian blows secrecy wide open. Costello gets clipped and survives. Anastasia gets erased. And Genovese, always convinced he deserved the crown, pushes too hard, too publicly, at the worst possible moment. The state doesn't need to prove every murder to break a boss. It only needs the one lane where evidence sticks. So, the narco era becomes the trap. Witnesses, couriers, controlled buys, paper trails, committees, judges who don't laugh at, "I don't know him." The underworld had survived by avoiding the camera. Now it's living on television, in transcripts, in wire photos, in front-page names. The hearings aren't just politics. They're a shift in weather. And in that weather, the next generation, the Kennedys, starts paying attention. John sees the public hunger for clarity. Robert sees the machinery behind the corruption. Unions, docks, money, violence treated like administration. They're not just looking at street gangsters. They're looking at a structure that learned long ago how to live beside government without becoming government, how to serve the state when useful, defy it when necessary, and disappear when threatened. Because Mussolini didn't end the mafia. He taught it how to migrate. And Genovese didn't just chase money. He helped show how narcotics could become the bloodstream of the post-war shadow economy. Criminal, political, and sometimes indistinguishable. Once that bloodstream exists, you don't shut it off cleanly. You reroute it. And when you reroute it, somebody always profits. History doesn't repeat because people are ignorant. It repeats because fear produces the same markets, the same slogans, the same shortcuts, and the same men selling certainty. In the 1940s, the world split into camps, and everyone revealed their instincts. Fascists promised order. Communists promised justice. Isolationists promised safety. Racists offered a target. Conservatives sold tradition. In America, at least on paper, you could support any of it. That was the pitch. Freedom. The reality was harsher. The people with money and insulation could speak freely. Everyone else was kept divided, arguing over flags and identities while decisions were made in boardrooms and private offices. That's what made the era volatile. America didn't just have opinions. It had factions. And some of those factions looked at Hitler and didn't see a monster yet. They saw efficiency. They saw a barrier against communism. They saw a nation fixed through force. Sympathy for authoritarianism wasn't imported. It was already present, in clubs, newspapers, business circles, and in the way powerful men talked when microphones were off. When Franklin Roosevelt began assembling his inner circle, deciding who mattered, who could be trusted, who would represent the United States abroad, one name surfaced repeatedly: Joseph Kennedy. Kennedy was wealthy, connected, ambitious, and impossible to ignore. He also carried an outlook that made him radioactive in London. Defeatism dressed up as realism. He didn't like Britain. He didn't believe it could win. While others spoke of survival, he spoke of accommodation. As ambassador to the court of St. James's, he gained a reputation that never faded, an American envoy who sounded, to British ears, like a man already drafting the obituary. That wasn't just a diplomatic problem. It reflected the mood of the age. Go back to 1929. The crash. The moment the floor gives way, and the crowd realizes the system can destroy them without warning. Winston Churchill was in New York as it happened, close enough to watch the market collapse in real time, close enough to hear the stories that moved like smoke. Men climbing high and jumping when fortunes vanished, and reputations evaporated in a single afternoon. Streets filled with families sleeping outside, wrapped in whatever they could find. A country suddenly unsure whether it was still the future or just another failed experiment. Churchill lost money too. He was burned like everyone else. The difference wasn't loss. It was insulation. Churchill was an aristocrat. The crash didn't turn him into a street casualty. It turned him into a wounded investor who still ate well, still drank well, and still assumed the wheel would turn back around, because it always had for his class. He received assistance from bankers who also understood what was coming in Europe and were already positioning themselves accordingly. Stories like that travelled. They always do. Roosevelt heard stories. He logged people. He remembered impressions. So, when Britain later found itself cornered, asking for ships, weapons, credit, Roosevelt didn't respond as a romantic. He moved like a tactician. He understood leverage. He wasn't going to be ordered into war by London. He wasn't going to drag the country in because Britain demanded it. Half of America wanted no involvement at all. Roosevelt had to move inches, not miles, while isolationists shouted, sympathizers hedged, and opportunists calculated where profit might land. That atmosphere is where Joseph Kennedy mattered. He became the respectable face of a sentiment many shared, but few voiced openly. Britain can't win. This isn't our war. A settlement is inevitable. He spoke like a man watching a building burn while discussing insurance forms. He went so far as to suggest publicly that democracy was finished in England. Words that landed like poison on a city already under aerial assault. He believed Britain should confront reality, consider accommodation, because he didn't believe Churchill's war could be sustained. Roosevelt responded the way he always did when someone became a liability. He worked around him. He used private channels. He deployed unofficial envoys. He kept his own lines open and allowed the official ambassador to drift into irrelevance. Inside the Kennedy household, the war became a lesson. Joseph Kennedy sent his sons abroad to see it firsthand. The Kennedys didn't just want to understand history. They wanted to position themselves inside it. That's where the story grows uncomfortable. In 1945, after Germany lay in ruins, John F. Kennedy traveled through the wreckage and recorded his observations in a private diary. The line that still unsettles people is the one that gets repeated. Hitler, he wrote, had the stuff of which legends are made. It's an easy sentence to weaponize. It sounds like admiration if you want it to. But Kennedy wasn't praising Hitler's morality. He was dissecting the mechanics of power. Myth, grievance, spectacle, mass psychology. He was examining how modern legends are manufactured. His point wasn't that Hitler was good. It was that Hitler was effective at building a story strong enough to outlive defeat, horror, and collapse. A legend that could persist, mutate, and recruit long after the flags were lowered. Kennedy was studying how dangerous men survive in memory, how narratives endure when regimes don't, how myth can keep working after authority collapses. Placed alongside the other case studies of the era, Mussolini's attempt to crush the Mafia, Hitler's assault on Freemasonry and other networks, a pattern emerges. States identify rival power structures. They dismantle them. They seize archives, names, money, and influence. They build legal frameworks to destroy enemies while claiming they are preserving the nation. Roosevelt was aging. He was a master operator, but also a man of institutions, alliances, and long memory. Joseph Kennedy was never going to wage war on America's hidden networks. He believed power was inherited, managed, and passed down quietly. John Kennedy wasn't there yet. Robert was different. When Robert Kennedy decided something was rotten, he didn't negotiate with it. He confronted it directly. That's where this thread is heading. But before any of them could choose their enemies, history made the choice for them. A single event erased debate overnight. It collapsed hesitation. It turned flirtation and sympathy into liabilities. Pearl Harbor. From that moment forward, America wasn't arguing about the war. America was inside it. And once the machine fully engaged, it didn't just fight armies. It began reorganizing its entire relationship with power, secrecy, and the underworld. That's where the truly astonishing part begins. Murder had always been part of the ritual, not just punishment, transition. Blood to close a chapter, blood to open another. April 15th, 1931 was one of those dates. Joe Masseria didn't just die in a restaurant booth, the old order died with him. The Mustache Pete world, the feudal, jealous, provincial Sicily by way of New York world, went down over lunch, betrayed by Italian gunmen and Jewish shooters acting on Lucky Luciano's orders. That's the part people remember: the shots, the betrayal, the photo in the papers, the name like a headline. What they forget is what came after, because what came after wasn't chaos. It was design. Salvatore Maranzano tried to claim the design for himself. He summoned the survivors and announced a new structure. 5 families. Bosses with boundaries, chains of command, a rule book. He crowned himself Capo dei Capi, boss of bosses, like he was restoring some ancient monarchy. He thought Masseria's murder completed the ceremony. He thought the crown was his. He didn't understand the rule that mattered most. The minute a man declares absolute power, he signs his own correction order. Luciano didn't correct him with a Sicilian knife or a street war. He corrected him with something colder: efficiency. Clean suits, calm voices, men who looked like they belonged in an office, not a gunfight. Red Levine led them. They joked later that it felt like an audit. But there was nothing funny about it. A Jewish gunman killing a Sicilian Catholic, boss of bosses, wasn't just a murder. It was a message. Bloodlines were finished. Performance was finished. Tradition was finished. The future would be corporate. After Maranzano fell, the survivors kept the structure and removed the throne. No king, no public crown, no wars that interrupted earnings. Disputes would be arbitrated, territories would be respected, and Italians would work with Jews, Irish, anyone who could deliver. Organized crime stopped pretending it was feudal and started operating like a company. That's the part that changed the country, not the body count. Because once it became a company, it began thinking like one. Supply chains, contracts, labor, enforcement as a service, silence as an asset. Prohibition taught them the blueprint. Ban alcohol and you don't erase demand. You reroute it. Liquor needs bottles, so they get into bottling. It needs warehouses, so they buy real estate. It needs trucks, so they take transportation. Trucks need fuel, so they slide into gas stations and oil. Roads follow. Pavement contracts, public works, city halls greased like hinges. Then the government becomes a problem, and the answer isn't a firefight. It's relationships. Judges you can talk to. Police you can lean on. Politicians who owe you. And when someone gets too loud, too reckless, too visible, you sacrifice them the way corporations sacrifice liability. You hand over a rival. You feed the system a scalp. You keep the machine moving. By the early 1930s, Luciano's syndicate wasn't just crime. It was infrastructure. It moved goods, people, money, influence. And it found leverage where America was most vulnerable: labor and ports. Whoever controlled the docks didn't just control theft, they controlled flow. And flow is the bloodstream of the economy. That's why New Orleans mattered. That's why men like Carlos Marcello mattered. Not because they were louder than New York, but because they were positioned. A Gulf city is an artery: shipping, military movement, commerce, politics, and all the quiet payments that come with it. New Orleans wasn't built on headlines. It was built on access. And then the country slid toward war. When America entered World War II, Washington panicked about the waterfront. Sabotage was the fear. The Normandy burned in New York Harbor, and the panic spread faster than the fire. The War Department wanted certainty. Naval intelligence wanted control. But one truth surfaced immediately. One truth everybody in the room already knew. The docks didn't belong to the government, not in practice. They belonged to the men who controlled labor, trucking, protection, and the unofficial rules that decided whether a port ran smoothly or bled out. Lucky Luciano was in prison, put there by Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor who built his reputation locking him away. Prison didn't end Luciano's authority. It relocated it. Meyer Lansky recognized the opening the way an operator recognizes a weak lock. The state needed order. The syndicate could provide it. When the state grows desperate, it stops pretending it has principles. The deal followed. Officially, the Mafia would help protect the waterfront. Unofficially, the Mafia gained legitimacy. Syndicate men patrolled piers. Labor problems vanished. Information moved upward. Luciano, still incarcerated, issued orders that carried more weight than badges. To make it work, Dewey bent. Luciano was transferred from hard time to comfortable quarters. After the war, parole followed. Then deportation, because the state still needed the story to end with justice. What never made the headlines was the negotiation behind the negotiation. Money moved, promises moved, and an understanding settled into place. The underworld was not outside the national security machine. It could be invited in when useful, and pushed out again when convenient. But deportation wasn't punishment. It was repositioning. Post-war Italy was shattered and strategically priceless. Mussolini was gone. The war was over, and American elites were sketching out something new, an intelligence service built on secrecy, deniability, and distance. Italy mattered, Sicily mattered, and an exiled Luciano, still intact, was the ideal instrument. The mechanics never changed. Organized crime-filled spaces governments could not publicly acknowledge. In France, the Corsican networks stabilized docks, broke communist union power, kept ports moving. Then Marseille became a pipeline. Heroin ran like commerce. And by the time the Central Intelligence Agency formally existed, it was already running operations beyond its mandate and budget. The money had to come from somewhere. The logistics had to come from somewhere. The deniability had to be real. That's how you get the same solution again and again: laundering networks, narco cash, and partners who don't appear in official reports. In 1947, the National Security Act made it permanent. The CIA was born, and communism became the universal justification. Under its charter, it could operate by any means necessary. In practice, which meant a quiet convergence, intelligence, business, crime, systems that had once run parallel, now sharing the same bloodstream. And then Cuba collapsed. Lansky had turned Havana into a gold mine under Batista: casinos, hotels, laundering pipelines, an empire dressed like tourism. Castro erased it overnight. The syndicate lost an empire. The CIA lost an instrument. Washington lost patience. The Bay of Pigs followed. So did the next phase, the kind of operations that looked like foreign policy on paper and like contract work in reality. Roselli, Giancana, Trafficante. Men pulled from the underworld because the underworld had always been the place you went when you needed something done without fingerprints. That's what makes the era so dangerous. Not the existence of criminals, the existence of a system willing to borrow them. And while the public argued over headlines, while they were taught to see gangsters as separate from government, the people inside the machine understood the truth. It was all negotiable. Everything: alliances, enemies, ethics, jurisdictions, even wars. Governments changed, flags changed, presidents rose and fell. The machine didn't collapse. It adapted. And when it adapted, it didn't get smaller. It got smarter. It learned to wear better suits. It learned to read contracts. It learned to live inside respectable institutions and call it business. That's the New Deal the country never voted on. A quiet agreement that when the state needed muscle, logistics, or silence, it could reach into the underworld. And when the underworld needed protection, it could reach into the state. Once that's true, everything that comes later stops feeling like isolated scandals and starts feeling like one long connected story. And by the time the Kennedys arrived, they didn't inherit chaos. They inherited a machine. By the late 1950s, the men who mattered, Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana, Tony Accardo, Joe Zerilli, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Santo Trafficante, Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magadino, Jack Dragna, weren't scrambling to build power anymore. That part was already done. The routes were mapped. The unions were compromised. The ports were spoken for. The judges were known quantities. The cops who mattered had already been paid or promoted or neutralized. The thing had weight now. Momentum. It didn't need inspiration. It just kept rolling forward, grinding down anything that wandered too close. And then the Kennedys showed up. Not as conquerors, as heirs. John Kennedy walked into a country that had been quietly arranged, while the public was distracted by war, prosperity, and television. Organized crime hadn't been pushed into the shadows. It had been invited inside, folded into the architecture of American power. Intelligence agencies borrowed its logistics. Corporations borrowed its discipline. Politicians borrowed its methods. Nobody called it corruption when it worked this well. Robert Kennedy was the one who noticed the seams. He'd watched reputations collapse during the McCarthy hearings, including his own. He'd seen how easily truth could be bent, how loyalty was transactional, how fear moved faster than evidence. When he turned his attention to labor rackets in 1957, he expected corruption. What he found instead was a parallel economy. Dummy unions, paper loans, no-show jobs, pension funds hollowed out and repurposed, murder treated as an accounting problem. The names kept repeating. The same brokers, the same fixers, the same families. And the families noticed him noticing. The attempt on Frank Costello wasn't just a power play. Neither was the execution of Albert Anastasia. Those weren't random acts of violence. They were corrections. Anastasia was erratic, loud, emotional. Bad for business at a moment when scrutiny was becoming dangerous. His death solved more than one problem at once. And within weeks, the illusion of secrecy shattered at Appalachian. When police stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. The national boardroom of organized crime, eating in the open, acting like it would always be untouchable. That was the moment the machine realized it had been seen. From there, everything accelerated. Weapons began moving the way narcotics once had. Cuba became a crossroads instead of a destination. Exiles trained in Louisiana swamps, in Florida camps, funded by men who understood logistics better than ideology. Arms flowed to failed invasions and future ones, to proxies and deniable allies, to places that would never appear on paper. Dictators didn't care who delivered the crates as long as the bullets arrived on time. The CIA didn't care who moved them as long as the fingerprints stayed clean. Kennedy saw the Bay of Pigs for what it was. Not a mistake, but a system operating without accountability. He took the blame publicly, but privately he understood the danger. His brother was tearing threads out of the same fabric, unions, ports, banks, contracts, while the intelligence community continued running operations that answered to no one. Hoover denied the existence of organized crime because acknowledging it would have meant admitting how long it had been useful. Eisenhower and Nixon had been perfect custodians of that arrangement. They didn't interfere. They didn't ask questions. Nixon knew these men personally, had walked Havana casinos with Lansky's people, watched money change hands, watched tourists get fleeced and looked away. He understood the rules. But that didn't mean the mob respected him. They remembered deportations. They remembered betrayals. They remembered promises whispered and never fulfilled. And they remembered that Jack Kennedy might be different. By the mid-1970s, the public was finally catching glimpses of what had always been there. Reports out of Texas spoke of multiple families circling Dallas like scavengers, treating it as open territory. Tampa, long declared clean by Orioles who knew better, was exposed as a web of gambling, narcotics, pornography and murder tied directly into national and international syndicates. Law enforcement denied it. Grand juries dismissed it. Witnesses died anyway. The pattern repeated everywhere. Investigators got too close. Files vanished. Informants were silenced. Men like Richard Cloud learned too late that you didn't need to be a cop to threaten the system. Just persistent. The machine adapted. It always did. Old dons died quietly of heart failure and strokes, replaced not by street killers, but by men who wore suits, read contracts, and understood Wall Street better than bookmaking. White-collar crime wasn't a departure. It was an upgrade. And through all of it, the Kennedy assassination refused to stay buried. Witnesses surfaced and disappeared. Testimony contradicted itself, and then contradicted the contradictions. Names like Loran Hall, John Martino, Ferry, Shaw, Roselli, Giancana. Ruby kept drifting back into view, orbiting the same gravity well. Files reopened. Committees fought among themselves. Evidence emerged just long enough to raise questions before being locked away again. Skepticism replaced innocence. The country learned that truth didn't vanish. It was managed. Carlos Marcello understood this better than most. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't give speeches. He didn't posture. Power, to Marcello, was something you demonstrated by surviving everything that was supposed to kill you. Deportations, indictments, investigations, presidents. When Congress summoned him decades later to ask about Ferry, he answered just enough to end the conversation. Payments acknowledged, motives denied. Nothing provable, nothing usable. That was always his genius. Because while reporters argued, while committees stalled, while theories multiplied, Marcello went home. He sat at his table. He ate with his family. He passed the bread. He talked about ordinary things. The kind of man who never needed to look over his shoulder because he understood something most people never would. The machine didn't belong to any one person anymore. It belonged to itself. And everyone who came after, presidents, prosecutors, investigators, even assassins, was just moving inside something that had already decided how far it was willing to bend without breaking.